Her name was Eleanor Elizabeth Healy, but most people in town just called her Nell, although it should be said that some of the people called her Daft Nell, and some called her Nell the Fool, and there were reasons for that. Nell lived in a small cottage, and she had a large garden and a big apple tree. And people would say, what are you going to do about those birds and those animals that eat all of your apples and eat all of the things from your garden? Nell would say, oh, I'm not going to do anything about them except make friends with them. You can't imagine what joy it gives me every morning to wake to the sound of bird call and to share my apples with those beautiful birds. And in the evening, I enjoy watching the rabbits and squirrels and other creatures creep out of the bushes and nibble on my carrots and lettuce. I'm not going to do anything else but just admire them. Well, theoretically, Nell had grown her fruits and vegetables and the apples to keep some for herself and to sell and trade others in town, if there were any left. But she had one other source of income. You see, Nell was a peddler, and she had a cart that was filled with what we would call today notions, lengths of fabric and lace and ribbon, needles and pins, that sort of thing. And she would push her cart to the neighbors' homes and to the village and a few neighboring villages. But here again, her friends would say, you give away more than you sell. And there was some truth to that. For when a young woman whose family had fallen on hard times was preparing to be married, Nell gave her a length of lace for a bridal veil. And the next year, when a child was born that did not survive the winter, Nell not only contributed the fabric for the shroud, but she sewed it herself. And the following year, when another child was born who did survive, Nell made the christening cap. Still, her neighbors would say, Nell, your foolish generosity will get you in trouble. The day will come when you will have nothing and you will be reduced to begging. That may be, Nell would say, but I will not change my ways. And the neighbors were right. The day did come. A day in early October, unseasonably cold, although it wasn't winter and just barely fall. But on that day, Nell looked around. There were no vegetables in the garden. There were no apples on the tree. There was no money saved and no food to be had. And that night, Nell went to bed hungry. In the night she dreamed. She dreamed that she heard a voice. It was the voice of her granny. And the voice said, Nell, child. Even in her sleep she smiled at that. For she was 70 and 10, plus a few more. Nell, child, that voice came again. Go into town, stand by the church, and you will hear good news. In the morning, Nell remembered the dream, but she said aloud as though her granny were there with her, Ah, Granny, I cannot go. I am too weak. I don't think I could walk all the way to town, for it was several miles. And so that day she spent preparing the garden for winter, and that night there was still no food, and she went to bed hungry again. In the night she had another dream. It was her granny again, her voice, and she could see her granny's face, those steel blue eyes looking right at her as her granny said, Nell, child, go into town, stand by the church, and you will hear good news. The next morning, Nell smiled at the memory of the dream and said, Granny, I can't go into town. And she spent that day scrubbing the floor and scrubbing the table, although she had to pause several times to rest. But that night she went to bed again hungry. And again she dreamed, and this time she dreamed of her granny's voice, her face, and her form, a small woman but powerful, with one hand on her hip and the other pointing right at Nell and saying, Nell, go into town, stand by the church, and you will hear good news. And the next morning when Nell remembered that dream, she said, "All right, Granny, I will go." And so she took her cloak, a practically threadbare scrap of fabric off the peg by the door, wrapped it around her shoulders against the cold and the surely coming storm, and she walked into town. It seemed to be a very long walk, for she had to pause several times. But when she got into town, she did go to the town square, and she stood by the church, not in front of the door. She did not want to look like she was begging, but she stood a little off to the side, where an overhanging roof would shield her from the morning sun and the coming storm. She stood there all day. It was a busy day in town. People were coming and going, buying and selling and trading, but no one stopped to talk to Nell or give her anything. And as the sun began to set, Nell thought to herself, "I don't think I can make it home. I'll just sleep overnight here in the churchyard. And if it happens that I freeze to death in the night, well, at least they won't have to move me very far into the grave." And she turned and was about to go into the churchyard when across that courtyard of the town there came a man, a stranger to Nell, and he said, "Woman, what are you doing here?" She looked at him. "You don't know me, but I'm the nephew of the innkeeper across the way. I've been watching the inn since he's been taken ill, but today I've been watching you. You looked like you were expecting something, a message or something, but far as I can tell, no one has even stopped to talk to you all day long. So you've been standing there in the cold and in the rain? Woman, what's your story?" And she opened her mouth to respond, but she was too weak to speak, and he could see that. So he said, "Follow me back to the inn, and I will at least give you a meal, and then you can tell me what you're doing here." Gratefully, she followed him back to the inn, and he laid out a simple meal, but more grand than a meal she'd had in many a month. And when she had eaten as much as she could, then the innkeeper's nephew leaned back in his chair, and he said, "So, what's your story?" And Nell began, "Well, I had a dream." Oh, the man burst in. "A dream? Are you telling me that you've been standing there all day in the cold and the rain because of a dream? Ah, woman, you must be a fool." She smiled at that. Yes, that's what she'd been called before. "Oh," he said, "everyone dreams. Everyone dreams. I dream. I dream all the time. Why, just the other night, I had a dream. I dreamed that if I were to follow that path out of town, I would get to a small cottage with a large garden and a big apple tree. And if I dug under the roots of that apple tree, I'd find a treasure." Can you imagine? You don't see me chasing after some treasure, do you? No, those dreams are so foolish. I stay here. I pay attention to business. I stick to what needs to be done. And I advise you to do the same. Well, Nell thanked the man for his advice and for the meal. And then she wrapped her cloak around her again, and she headed for home, down that path. But the way home seemed shorter than it had that morning, for she had new energy and a new plan. When she got home, it was dark, but by the light of the moon, she took a shovel and she began to dig under the roots of her very own apple tree. Not a foot down, her shovel hit something hard. She brought it up. It was a chest, a metal chest, and when she pried open the lid, she found that it was filled with gold, ancient gold, long forgotten gold. And the neighbors wondered how, in the months and years that came, that Nell could not only continue her generosity, but double it and double it again and double it again. They wondered, but they did not complain about the good things she did. Well, Nell lived for 15 more years, And when finally she did pass away in her sleep, gently, kindly one night, she was taken to the churchyard where she'd anticipated being buried so long before. And this time she was placed in a grave, and there was a headstone erected. It gave her name and the date of her birth, the date of her death. And then beneath that, it said 3 things. Always follow your heart, always follow your dreams, and always listen to your granny. And that is the story of Nell the Fool, Eleanor Elizabeth Healy.